Welcome to the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show on Revcoms' YouTube channel, The Revcoms. This is episode number 7 on May 7th, 2020. I want to welcome my friend and colleague and co-host, Sarah Taylor.
How you doing, Andy?
I'm doing good, and I want to welcome Luan, who is a member of the Revolution Club and the Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour. How you doing?
I'm all right.
All right, good. All right, so we're here back in our garage, and we're bringing to you a show. This show, the RNL Show, is a show like no other. Quite simply, there is nothing else that is about why we need an actual revolution. A revolution aimed at overthrowing the existing system, which is all over the world. It is a dog-eat-dog system. It's the dog-eat-dog system of capitalism, imperialism. And these are big words that too few people know and understand. But through watching this show every week, you're going to come to see that this is the name of a system that destroys lives and crushes spirits, and that has long since outlived its usefulness to humanity. And in fact, it is not just totally unnecessary to provide for the needs of humanity and the planet, but it stands as a barrier to a life where humanity could truly flourish. And that brings me to something else that you will only see here on the Revolution Nothing Less show. But before I get to that, I want to say something to you, our viewers. That we don't think of you just as an audience, but people we hope to inspire and move to become a part of the revolution, part of the solution to the problems that people here and around the world face. We need you, and you need this show. Now, something else that you will only get here at the Revolution Nothing Less show is that we bring you a vision and a concrete plan for a far better society that would only become possible with the overthrow of this system. And that vision, that plan is concentrated in the Constitution for a new socialist republic in North America. And where did that come from? It was written by the most important political thinker and leader working today, Bob Avakian, a revolutionary who came out of the 1960s and in the decades since has been leading and developing a movement for revolution, and who has never stopped learning from the past revolutions as well as from the broad experience of humanity and people all over the world to develop a way out of this madness. And this has resulted in a new synthesis of communism, which we call the New Communism. Now, Bob Avakian, who we call BA, was an active participant in and was forged in the struggles of the 1960s at a time of great turmoil and struggle, a time when there were revolutionary struggles around the world and which had its reflection here in the United States. As a student at Cal in Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley, he became involved in the free speech movement. And then he went on to become a leader in the Vietnam Day Committee, which was based in the Bay Area. And you can read about this history and his development in his memoir, From Ike to Mao and Beyond. And this includes his recounting of working with the Black Panther Party in its early days, a period that he tells was instrumental in his becoming a revolutionary, in his transition from a radical opposed to the war in Vietnam and opposed to the oppression of black people, something he felt as a youth, and becoming an implacable enemy of the system itself. And he developed there into both a revolutionary, and it was his first step to becoming a communist. So last week we showed a clip from a film Bob Avakian made in 2018, why we need a revolution, why we need an actual revolution, and how we could really make a revolution. So what I want to do now is just play a short excerpt from the excerpt we played last time.
By 1968 and for several years after, there were large numbers of people in this country, including millions of youth from the middle class, as well as masses of poor and oppressed people, who were motivated by a thoroughly justified hatred of this system and aspirations for a radically different and better world. And this reached deeply into the system's own armed forces. Even if the understanding of most was marked by revolutionary sentiment, which, while righteous, was lacking in any deep and consistent scientific basis. And the real failure of that time was that there was not yet a revolutionary vanguard with that scientific foundation and method, and the orientation, strategy, and program that could give organized expression to the mass revolutionary sentiment and lead a real attempt at actually making revolution. That is a challenge before us now. And now, particularly because the work that I have done and the leadership I have been providing over the decades since the 1960s, we do have the further development of the scientific method and approach to revolution with the new communism.
So that was Bob Avakian, and he said, this is the challenge before us now. So today we have a really packed show with 3 incredible segments that we're going to bring all of what he just said to life in different ways. Our first segment, earlier this week on May 4th, it was the 50th anniversary of the murder of 4 students at Kent State University, a large university that still exists in Ohio, by the National Guard in response to the protests by the students in opposition to the war in Vietnam. And then just 9 days later at Jackson State College, an all-black college in Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi, the Highway Patrol murdered 2 students and shot 12 more who were seriously wounded in a fusillade of bullets. Then our next segment, the second segment on the show, we're going to feature Bob Avakian from answering a question in Chicago, where, as some of you know, the police egregiously murdered Luan McDonald, and where there's tremendous attention to the fighting among the black youth and killing each other. But he goes into this in a very deep way, into what this system does to people. What are the choices it offers to them? What do the police do to people to enforce this system? And why it offers no future for the youth and what we have to do about it. I'll say more about that when we get to the second segment. And our final segment is of tremendous importance, and it's of the moment. The goddamn normalization of these fascist rallies, armed white supremacist thugs under the orders and fomented by Donald Trump and the Trump-Pence fascist regime, marching into the city squares, marching into the streets, and going right up into the state houses and threatening. And the fact that this is being normalized, that it's just another item on the news, is something that we have to pay attention to, because that's a horrific future that faces people in this country with impact around the world. But part of this story is not just that. The other side of this story is that it happened on May 1st, and the Revcoms, the revolutionary communists, went out to meet this in different cities around the country, along with Refuse Fascism, who had called protests in many different cities. But the Revcoms went out and said, hey, there's another future. This isn't, and you saw really arrayed against each other the future of these fascist goons screaming, America first, all this kind of stuff. But on the other side was the Revcoms saying, we put the interests of humanity first, humanity first. So this is a very exciting segment, and we have a special treat for you. We've been waiting since we started this show to bring you Pete on the Street. You'll find out what that is. You got to watch the whole show to find out about that. So look, that's our show. It's packed, but take this ride with us and let us know what you think in the comments section below as you go along. So let's go for a ride. Last episode, I did an interview with a student leader here in Los Angeles, and he's an activist, and he observed that on the campuses today, the situation is very conservative. The administrations are repressive, and now in a time of coronavirus, he's really doubted whether or not there could be much resistance on the campuses, the kind of atmosphere that we people often referred back to in the 1960s. But I told him that, you know, in the 60s, in the early 60s, the campuses were very conservative. That was the mainstream of the students. But as the 60s went on and the struggle intensified, that changed. But also all through the 60s, even into the 70s, and continuing to today, the administrations were very much feeding into the war machine, feeding into the business as usual with the system, and were highly repressive. Even as the university did have that element within it of a sense of questioning all of society, and that's something we need to revive today. But look, the 60s were a time of upheaval and national liberation struggles and revolution around the world, and that had its reflection in this country. So there's a lot in the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Kent State, the killing of 4 students, Jackson State, the killing of 2 students, that have a tremendous relevance for what we face today and what could become possible. There is the potential, when you see some footage we're going to show you in just a minute, that could make you imagine the potential for a real, genuine struggle for liberation to arise again in this country, because all the problems that the students were talking about back then, and all the upheaval, even the cultural rebellions that happened in the music and in the culture, in the long hair, in the sexual revolution, all of this, the yearning for that kind of freedom still exists today. But one great advantage we have today, as I said at the beginning of this episode, is that today we actually have a strategy for a revolution. Today we have a leadership in Bob Avakian and BA and in a movement that's growing up around that. So we have a tremendous advantage, even as we have to crack open again once this lid that is sitting on people. But let me give you some background on Kent State, just a few facts to be able to contextualize what we're going to watch in this film. 50 years ago, on May 4th, in 1974, students at Kent State University were gunned down by the Ohio National Guard. And just days before, even as Nixon had announced that he was pulling out of Vietnam, he launched a major invasion of Cambodia. This was a complete betrayal, and it inflamed all of us, high school students, college students, and people were really angry about this, and you began a wave of protests, that included occupations of various buildings on campuses. And in response to this, governors, and in this case, the governor of Ohio, sent in the National Guard to several colleges in Ohio, including at Kent State. Now, at Kent State, the students went forward with their protests, but on May 4th, they gathered, and there was a scene that was developing, and the National Guard fired tear gas at the students. But the students wouldn't back down. And then there's 13 seconds that changed the course of history, and that needs to be remembered to change the course of history even more. In 13 seconds, the National Guard fired between 61 and 67 shots, and 4 students were killed, one of whom was just on his way to class. 9 others were wounded. Then just several days later, there was a murder in Augusta of a number of black people in Augusta, Georgia. But then on May 13th at Jackson State College in Jackson, Mississippi, the capital of Mississippi, the highway patrol came out with just the word that there was going to be a protest on the campus. There was a protest, but it was very small. They came in, they swooped in, and they just fired a fusillade of bullets, murdering 2 students and wounding 12 others. And just to give you a sense of these times, and some of this you'll see in this footage, there was a report from the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, and this is what it said quite plainly. The crisis on the American campuses has no parallel in the history of this nation. This crisis has its roots in the divisions of American society as deep as any since the Civil War. Well, can we say that that is over today? Aren't we actually living through a continuation of that? You're looking at the development of this Trump-Pence fascist regime and the rallies that happened on May 1st in this country at this time. And as Bob Avakian has said, you can draw a direct line from the Trump-Pence fascist regime to the Confederacy. So this has tremendous relevance both in the fascistic nature of it and in the resistance. So I want you to watch, in particular watch what this young man says at Jackson State College. So what you're going to see is a gift to us, actually, from David Zeiger, who's a filmmaker, a friend of this show, who made the film Sir No Sir. You should look it up on the internet. It's a very important film about the resistance of the GIs, the soldiers in Vietnam. And this little bit of footage here he gave to us, we're just going to run a clip of it that gives you a taste of what happened at Kent State, but goes into Jackson State, what happened there, because too many people do not know about this. So let's go to the film, and then I'll have a few closing comments after the film.
41 and 20. Go ahead, 41. Man, they're right in front of the Student Union building, that new Student Union building right on Lane Street. Maybe about 50 of them. 10-4. All that security guard out there, Jackson State, and see if they can't scatter them niggas. They're running wild and hollering, and there's just looks like a congregation of these people running back and forth across the street. We have a perimeter set up here, but we are being rocked. Should we go ahead and gas them in these dormitories? Just hold off. But our people are going in there now to move the people out of the street.
Met with university presidents. They were all scared to death. Feel that this now includes the non-radical students, and agreed that the whole university community is now politicized, and there's no way to turn it off. General feeling is that without Kent State, it would not have been so bad. But that even without Cambodia, there were a lot of campuses ready to blow.
President Nixon's Commission on Campus Unrest, appointed a month ago, today held its opening hearing.
Too many of our university presidents and deans have been gravely remiss in summoning law enforcement officials when conditions on the campuses got completely out of order. As a matter of fact, there are precedents that were shown an irrational hostility toward law enforcement officials. We believe this has contributed, and in some instances it contributed very seriously to this problem.
When I was a freshman, a building was taken over by the black students on campus, and all the things that have been negotiated for 2 years, and oh, I'm sorry, we can't do that right away. It's going to take a while. We're going to offend our alumni. Like that, they were initiated. How else do you expect someone, people who are aware, people who are very concerned about problems, how else do you expect them to react? If the only thing that's going to move the administration is blowing up a building, then you blow up a building, or either you say, well, we don't really want to change it that much anyway.
What should we do to these students that assault your academic freedom?
When I first met Joseph, I instantly found him a compelling figure.
Should we shoot them? Should we arrest them? Should we shoot them with shotguns or birdshot? What should we do? How do we preserve your academic freedom from those who assault you?
When Joseph and I began to talk about working together, we wanted to make sure we could find a way to get authentic details at each college or university about what had really happened. And the main thing on our mind was that Joseph had the impression from Governor Scranton that the governor, the head of the commission, wanted us to be in effect, a counter investigation to that being done by the FBI.
The more they back up, the more they retreat, the more they concede, the more they'll be driven to the wall.
So we started out thinking we have to find the real truth. We have to find the authentic details of what happened without our being influenced by any need to cajole or please any politician.
Well, today at 7:30, I spotted two maintenance trucks with white people in them with glasses. Now, my immediate reaction was to run down there and stop them. I asked why. They said, "They're going to cover up the holes." Now, I want to tell the reason why we don't want the holes covered up. Because this is a monument to show that what the degradation, deprivation, and dehumanization what the power struggle has done to us. You can see the physical evidence here. This is why we don't want it taken down. If necessary, we'll stay here 24 hours. Die if necessary, starve, but we're not going to move. And we're all united behind here. And we're going to stay here 24 hours if necessary till hell freeze over.
Well, how long should this debris remain here?
Permanently. Because you see, Philip Gibbs' death is permanently. I knew Philip Gibbs. And James Green, too. I'm going to tell you something. I knew Philip Gibbs. He took a class with me back in Mina. He was in my department, see, and he's a brother. The only crime that he committed was he was born black. This is why he's going to stay here and make everybody see. If not the state of Mississippi, but Washington, D.C., and let everybody see. Like it says, we will not be satisfied till justice is done. And we'll show everybody that their death shall not have been in vain.
The President's Commission on Campus Unrest moved its hearings to Mississippi today to study the causes of last May's violence at Jackson State College. It got a chilly welcome. The Lieutenant Governor accused the commissioners of trying to put the blame for the incident on the State Highway Patrol, and today's hearings opened on a defensive note.
On the night of May 14th, 1970, 2 students at Jackson State College were killed and 12 wounded in a hail of gunfire from law enforcement officers. Shots were fired into 24 windows and 18 metal panels of Alexander Hall, the college's main women's dormitory.
Willie Woodward, a resident of Jackson who's not a student, was struck in the left side of his back and his lung was collapsed. There was another student. There was a student named Leroy Kenter who was struck right in between the building and the bushes here, whose thigh was shattered. And then a number of persons were struck as they were rushing toward the entrance door of the dormitory. There's a pile of students developed there because of the narrow entryway.
Antoine ran across the street and went to where Philip Gibbs was lying there, took his t-shirt off and wiped the blood away from his face. And I walked over and I looked down at him. The right side of his face, I believe, had just been blown away.
Does your department plan to take any corrective steps in view of what happened?
Not that I know of.
Inspector, are you telling me that in your judgment it wasn't necessary to shoot, in your judgment that what happened was an overreaction on the part of police, and that your department is not taking any steps to prevent this sort of action in the future?
There was no doubt in my mind that some of us would have been killed down there if the volley of shots hadn't gone off, and I see no reason to discipline a man for saving his own life.
They lied to us. In direct testimony, they lied. People who were sworn under sworn oath before this commission came right out and lied to the President's Commission on Campus Unrest.
In its report released today, the commission concludes that the action of the police was an unreasonable, unjustified overreaction.
The Mississippi is a police state ruled by terror. The black people in Mississippi are in everyday danger of being murdered in the streets by elements of the law enforcement agencies of the state, and that the only thing that can stop mass murder in the state by law enforcement officials who are above the law, do not obey the law, is for the President of the United States to immediately and forcibly insert the federal presence by affirmative action, if necessary, ruling the state from Washington by injunction.
I was extremely idealistic as a journalist, as many journalists are, especially at the beginning, when you think that if you reveal truth about certainly about troubling matters of national significance, which these certainly were, you felt that the truth would help.
And did it?
No.
The commission said a significant cause of the deaths and injuries is the confidence of white officers that if they fire weapons during a black campus disturbance, they will face neither stern departmental discipline nor criminal prosecution or conviction.
I was profoundly disappointed. We couldn't ultimately get an audience for the truth we had found.
Let's let that really sink in. So, Luan, you probably haven't ever seen this footage before, so how did it strike you?
That shit made me so angry. It just, you see, like, I've heard the song Ohio, like, where it talks about those youth, the 4 dead, and even, like, kind of listening to that when I first heard it, it really, moved me. But seeing this, like, in Jackson, it was in Mississippi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jackson, Mississippi, with all these students, all these young people, like, and how their lives were just snuffed away like that, like in the middle of this, like hearing just how like blatant, this was done with such like vitriol. It just was really enraging, like thinking about like how that actually happened. And I just couldn't help but think about some of what the student was saying in the I think it was a courtroom or something, and she was talking about like the stuff that the students wanted, and just was very upfront and clear about how when people actually acted, then shit started changing. And I think that, well, one, it's kind of hard to imagine that that was the state of how things were, like that was something that actually happened. You think about like how things are now, like in the schools, and there's a lot of attention to like a fight for like normalcy, or just, go about your business, go about your career, there's a lot of like drumming into people of just thinking about your own life and your own personal experience and how you can rise above, yet this happened, yet when people actually were stepping up and looking at the whole world and were actually stepping out there was such a hard repression, against them. And I thought that, you think about in the more recent times when some students have actually started to do some things around like police brutality and some of these other stuff, some of the repression that people were actually met with. And I just kind of think that, one, there's actually a deep need for people to be looking at, well, what is the reality of we're facing? Like, what is actually coming down on us? It's not just some white people. It's not just some, people who are acting randomly. It's a whole system. And I thought that how you see, one, there's how the cops sound exactly like the same cops sound every single time someone is murdered by the police now. Same story. Oh, he feared for his life. Oh, I thought he was in danger, The same story, It's not that, it just was really striking just how literally it's the same words, And I think that one is actually a deep need for people to not just lose hope because we hear that all the time, and to not just get kind of lost in the day-to-day, but actually, let's actually change this. Let's end this. This is something that we can end, and we're talking about this on this show in different ways, and I can't help but think about like some of my own history, and I don't want to say all of it, but like, being a freshman on the campus and, you're fresh and you're new to school and you saw how young those kids were. You saw how young they were and the fact that their lives were snuffed out like that. This is what this system does. This is what it continues to do and what it's going to do if we do not actually stop it. And you get a really deep sense of that. And I think that, one, there's a need for people to actually be talking about actual revolution now on the campuses in a serious way, like not just about, off into the future, but now. You think about the Nazification of the campuses, the fascistization, how, from UC Berkeley to Middlebury, all over the fucking country and frankly all over the world. But you look at this country in particular, like we do have to get off of just talking about things on terms of people's personal experience and then leaving it at that. This is a world historic thing that we actually have to change. And that's going to take us actually looking at the evidence and actually seriously engaging what's a real solution and not getting lost in just looking at the effects of some of these things.
Couldn't you, one thing that struck me in watching this was the very familiar, as you say, arrogance and denial by the police. But on the other hand, there was the fear that you could sense in the ruling establishment from what the students has done. And I think this is something that people lose sight of and haven't experienced, or your generation hasn't experienced, and many people are learning this through that period too, that when the people rise up like this, it struck fear in the hearts of them. Those notes of H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's aide, writing them down. This is very important for people to grasp. They actually have power if it gets used. And now we have the strategy, as you're bringing out, to actually go all the way. But did that strike you too, that sort of sense of like, oh my God, we don't have control of the universities?
Yeah, I mean, the way that it's kind of depicted, it's kind of like you see the back-to-back, the images from all over, like from Ohio to, across the country, the thing about the ROTC buildings and other stuff.
But people really did rise up. And it's not without stakes, not without consequence, but it also was extraordinarily liberating feeling. And I think you could sort of sense that through this, even with the great personal tragedy of a few people, and not just a few people.
Yeah, I mean, this thing, I do think that you see some of I think what made this so different was that it wasn't just, even though there was there were the people's personal lives, and the particular people, losing people, it hurts, but it wasn't just the fact that it was actually connected to something larger that was against, there was the Vietnam War, against that, against the treatment of how those people were being killed basically by America, by the military, and there actually was a very conscious move by people who were casting aside America, casting aside America first, me first, that. And I think that it's true that there was like the fear of the system, but even like the character of that fear was more around losing the hold of power, which is much different than, something that I think that people have, something that I think that people have seen more in the recent period, even as that hold isn't permanent. There hasn't actually been like a shock on that kind of level, and even what people now are kind of doing, it's a little, out there. But I do think that some of the I do think that some of the challenge is actually for people to get outside of themselves in a very big way. And that's what I hope that people get a sense of, in this.
Yeah, well, just, we have to move on to the other segments, but I was really struck, too, by the defiance of that student, the young student who was speaking on the megaphone in front of the Jackson State College. That sense of defiance, that sense of here we stand and here we'll stay. You had that sort of spirit of we're going to fight this. You need that fighting spirit. That was something that we have to recapture instead of what you're talking about, that let's start with me. And sure, it's a horrible tragedy. I can't remember his first name, but Gibbs, 21 years old, married, a baby. It's a terrible tragedy. This family never gets over that. But there was something bigger being fought for, and you saw that in those students. And the problem is, for all that struggle, we face the same thing today, and we've got to actually act on that. There is a song that I will tell people to look it up on the internet, called Mississippi Goddamn by Nina Simone. And that captures a great deal about this time, because I think a searing lesson from that section on Jackson State is, yes, not just Mississippi Goddamn, but America Goddamn. This country will never, never let black people in their masses to be full human beings. And that's something we should never forget. It's also something that we have to act on. Okay, so this is an important segment. I hope that all of our audience, as well as people particularly who are living the life that Bob Avakian is speaking to in this next film segment, really think deeply about. In 2018, Bob Avakian went around the country and gave talks called Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Can Really Make a Revolution. And after these talks, he did question and answer sessions. And in Chicago, he gave the answer that you're about to see. It's very substantive. Look, the situation was one in which in Chicago there had been this unbelievable police murder of Laquan McDonald. People now at this point have seen the video, but it had been suppressed for a long time. He was shot 16 times in his back. You saw his body bouncing up and down off of the street. And right when this talk was given, there was a moment when the government at that point, due to the struggle of the people, had been forced to make an agreement or to propose an agreement with the police so the police would behave. And the first question that was asked in the Q&A there was about what did Bob Avakian think about this? And this comes against a whole background of Chicago being at the center of our black youth are killed. What about black on black crime? What about black on black crime? Don't black youth kill each other a lot? And it's a tragedy that they do, and we've done some work in the community there to deal with this. But Bob Avakian goes very deeply in this section. He poses a question, so what does this system do with youth who have no future and no prospects? It contains them. It robs them of any decent future. So I want to just go right to the clip. Now listen, it's 20 minutes, but this is some of the most important 20 minutes you'll spend today. So let's roll the film.
As Fred used to say, and the beat goes on, they just recently passed last week a new consent decree in Chicago. What are your thoughts on that?
What's the content of it?
Police brutality.
But they're supposed to, this is what the Chicago Police Department is supposed to not do? Is that kind of what this is about, these consent decrees?
It is.
They're supposed to limit their brutality. Is that the idea of them?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I would look at it this way. On the one hand, when they are forced to sign consent decrees, it's a reflection of the struggle of the people having put things in terms of, mic is off? It's on? Anyway, the people have actually, it's not that they did it out of the goodness of their heart or they woke up one day and said, oh, we've been brutalizing and murdering a lot of people. Let's sign an agreement that we're not going to do that as much anymore. No, it's more that they recognize that the degree and the ways in which they've been doing this has kind of exposed something very basic about their whole system, and has aroused the anger of a lot of people, including not only the people that they want to brutally keep down, that's one thing, but also other people like in the middle class and so on who want to cling to the illusion that this is a society of, justice and fairness and all these kind of things, but who find it harder and harder to do so in the face of, these killings one after the other, And we saw, for example, in the Laquan McDonald thing, it's just, let me say one thing, when I was doing up the list of people killed for this presentation, I kept feeling badly because, well, this one should be included and that one should be, but there's so many people that you can't include all of them, and I just want to make clear, it's not that I'm unaware of all, it's just that there are literally thousands of people. And that's the real striking thing, is the list goes on and on. There are just so many, and it's seemingly every day that there's another one. Or if it's not the police, it's these Zimmerman types. In Florida, you all probably saw about this. I think it was also in Florida, this stand your ground law. I'll get back to this point, but I just wanted to say this. This stand your ground law, where I don't know if you all saw this, but there was a thing where there was an altercation in a parking lot, and this guy, this white guy in Florida has a gun, and he's harassing this woman in the car because the car is parked in a handicap zone or something, and takes it upon himself to act like a pig, and so the boyfriend or whatever, this woman comes out and pushes the guy to the ground, and that's would be the end of it, except the guy pulls out his gun and kills him, while lying on the ground. This kind of whole thing is of a piece with what the police do, and now, of course, when you have, Trump and, unreconstructed white supremacists like Jeff Sessions is the chief law enforcement officer in the country who's trying to do away. See, I told you I'd get back to it. He's trying to do away with all these consent decrees, So the point is that there's a certain atmosphere they're setting, and, in Chicago they have a Democratic administration, with Emmanuel, who's all tied in with Obama and everything, and they're trying to act as if they're paying some attention to this, but it won't, on the one hand, like I said, it's a certain recognition that a lot of people are angry about this. On the other hand, these consent decrees, while they may, in a certain limited way temporarily cause them to be a little more careful, it won't change anything fundamental because of everything that, I was talking about in terms of the role of the police. And look, here's the situation. You've got a whole section of people, in particular youth, Latino youth and black youth, and in the country, in the inner cities, who, like I was saying, back in the days of when the masses of people like black people were living in the rural South, working on cotton plantation, tobacco plantations, or whatever, even after the slavery ended, that was like vital to the economy. And then, as you all know, after like World War I, but especially more so after World War II, millions of people, black people, left the South. Kind of on the one hand, the positive thing of hoping they could find a better life, and the negative thing of getting away from the really concentrated, oppression in the South, the sort of naked brutality. And for a while, people, I've made this point before, but it's important to understand this a little bit as in terms of like why things are the way they are right now, specifically. And so a lot of people got jobs in, even well-paying jobs after a while, even though they were stuck for a long time in the, Carl can talk about that, working in the steel plant, and all the people who, black people got hired and then never got out of the, the shit jobs in the factories. But still, there was a opening for a lot of people to get hired in the auto plants in Detroit, or the, some of the meat packing here, I think, and the steel plants in the south side of Chicago. It used to be thousands of people working there. Gary, Indiana, I think, had one of the largest steel plants in the entire world back in the 60s or whatever. And almost all of those things are gone. And so first they went, a lot of the capitalists moved their stuff to the rural South where they could hire people more cheaply, and then they moved it to Mexico. They have the plants, they set up the, maquiladores, I think they call them, they set up on the border in Mexico, and then, where they're paying people even less, exploiting them more. Then they move from there to places in Asia. And so what's happened is, the youth coming up have no prospects of any kind of, that kind of employment that people coming after World War II had some opportunity to get into. And so what does the system do with youth for whom it has no future and no prospects? It contains them. It robs them, like I said, of any decent future, contains them, and then promotes in various ways the whole idea. Contains them violently. That's why we're talking about police murders and consent decrees. So violently contains them, and violently. And I remember when I was living in Chicago back in the 1970s. Actually, I lived in Maywood, but there was a whole phenomenon. Did I say something wrong? Oh, I see. Okay. Well, anyway, that's where I lived for a number of years back in the 70s, and there was a whole phenomenon where, the what was it called? The gang intelligence unit that they had would, infiltrate the gangs and then set up gangs to fight each other, and then, when they would bust somebody, they would take them from one gang or set and drop them off in the territory of another one to get shit going. And I remember back in the days of the Black Panther Party, when it was headed by Fred Hampton, and he was trying to work with some of the gangs, and then the FBI sent a letter, to Jeff Fort, who was the head of the Peastone Nation, saying that the Black Panther Party had a plot to assassinate him and so on and so forth, to try to set up this stuff. So this is the kind of stuff that they do. In other words, here was a revolutionary force that didn't have the science that was needed. It was sort of had one foot in reform and one foot in revolution, the Black Panther Party. But it was a very advanced force for that time. We all learned a lot from them, those of us who were around then. So I just want to be clear about that. But they were trying to win some of these youth who were caught up in the gangs to become part of the revolution. And then this is the conscious way the government, the FBI and so on, worked to prevent that. So they have a lot of ways and then they set up these youth. After a while, the thing gets going on its own. You get into these conflicts, and then, the whole thing of, first of all, a thing of revenge. It's a never-ending cycle where, you killed my nephew or my kid, now you have to die, then it comes back the other way. So that's one thing. But also, if you've taken away everything from people, and they have no future, people are going to find a way to try to do something that expresses, in however wrong ways, expresses their feeling that they're worth something. No matter how messed up what they're doing might be. It's and this is something that's left to people, was to form street organizations, and then a lot of it, like I said, is imitating the whole system in the first place, and the ways of thinking, the ideology of the system. But you get into it, it takes on a life of its own, and then pretty soon you're deeply into it. And when you're young, you both get drawn to it, but you also can get forced into it. I know many people had to try to send their kids away, so that they wouldn't get forced into the gangs. But it also has an attractive force. It's a way of having meaning, even though it's really messed up. But it's a way of having meaning. And let's face it, compared to revolution, if you just want to look at it, things in the very short term, it's easier. Like we're talking about a really big thing of taking on this whole system and doing a lot of work to get to the point where you could actually have a chance to win. Well, you know, if you got a certain mindset and a certain thing that you're into, going down the street and shooting somebody who's on the wrong block is easier. You know, in the short run, it's easier. You know, it doesn't require you to make big changes. It's what's been left to you. And, you know, that's why this stuff has to be really struggled with hard and really met deep down where people really feel and struggle hard over about what should your life really be about. Look into a lot of people who are into the stop the violence stuff. I know I'm getting far afield here, but this is important, I think. You know, a lot of people are into stop the violence stuff. They have good intentions, but at least to some degree, and some of them, they end up working with the police and everything, you know, because they don't understand, and they have to. This has to be really brought home, that you're not going to get these youth out of this unless you have a whole different way you're coming at that really speaks to the whole thing they're caught up in, whether they really know that or not yet. You know, you can't just come to them saying, stop the violence, and do what? Let's be real. Stop the violence and do what? You know, work for chump change all my life for a job that then goes away anyway. And, you know, listen. There is not a single sphere of life in this society, now you all know this, but I got to say it anyway, in which black people do not get the dirty end of the stick. And not a single thing. I was reading an article in the New York Times about the changing economy. A lot of these industrial jobs I was talking about are gone. You know, and you know, this applies also to people from El Salvador and other things, but there's a whole history of black people in this country, you know. Puerto Rico also, you know, there's a whole history which we can get into, but there's a particular history of black people in this country. And I was reading this article in the New York Times, and it's the changing economy. And it was talking about the loss of industrial jobs and the shift from industrial work to service work. You know, people directly interacting with the public and sales. And you know, just put another thing in the picture. I was reading some statistics that somebody, you know, did some research on, and that 80% of the industrial production jobs in the world are now done in the third world, if you include China. So that tells you a lot about where everything is gone. You know, most of the clothes are made in Bangladesh. Seafood is done in Thailand. I mean, it's just, you know, they're Haiti, Pakistan, over. You know, this is where most, you know, see, this country is sitting at the end of the food chain. All these people, you know, the coltan for your cell phone is mined by people under terrible conditions in a place like the Congo. So, you know, all this work is gone because it's the nature of the system. They can exploit people much more ruthlessly in these conditions where they messed up these countries. And don't even tell me about, well, it's better than not having a job at all. You know, if we didn't go in there and do that, they wouldn't have anything. Bullshit. There's lots of raw materials to lots of people. You could have a whole different economy that didn't exploit people if you had a revolution. So I don't want to hear your crap about how if we didn't exploit them, they'd be even worse off. But anyway, this article I was reading in the New York Times, it made the point that this shift from industrial to service work in this country has hit black men particularly hard because while a lot of people, you know, and they're talking about white people, let's face it, who go into these stores are willing to interact with black women but not so willing to interact with black men. Now, you know, good if the black women have the jobs. Let's just be clear about this. This is not a thing against the black women at all. But what is the point here? They've created this whole image that I was talking about through the culture and everything. You know, and it's why you have the thing in Starbucks in Philadelphia and, you know, and Lake Merritt in Oakland. See, I grew up in the Bay Area. I know about Lake Merritt in Oakland. A lot of people go there and hang out, you know, black people, white people, whatever. And, you know, somebody calls the police on some black family because they're barbecuing with charcoal briquettes, which the city of Oakland has a thing against for environmental reasons. They call the pigs on them. You know, okay, why? Because people have gotten this image that's been consciously created I mean, look, a lot of the youth are in messed up stuff, okay, but there's also been a conscious effort to to portray all these youth as a bunch of savages. You know, so everything, it's all the way this system operates. It's just like you're not going to change it with consent decrees or calls on people to stop the violence. You got to change it with a revolution. And you got to go deep with these youth, deep and hard with these youth about, you know, what is really worth living and dying for. Let's get right down on the ground with what is worth living and dying for. If you're going to fight and die, at least let's get to the point. You know, we have to get into the science of it and why we can't just jump the whole thing off now. But let's get to the point where at least if you're going to fight and die, let it be for something that'll leave the next generation coming along a much better world, rather than what they've got you caught up in now. And, you know, we can understand why they're caught up in it, but there's got to be, we got to go deep and hard to fight about, you know, make your life count for something that really would be meaningful to people that you do care about, whether you act like you care about them or not. You know, you see them out there. I see the gangbangers out there with their little kids rolling around in strollers. Don't tell me you don't care about anybody else. You know, we got to go deep and hard to get to where people really feel and struggle with them about what is worth living and dying for. Look, you know, I have to say one other thing. I know I'm going all over the place here, but just let me say this and then we'll get to the next question. I get really mad when people say, well, you're all just talking about revolution, you're going to get people killed. People are getting killed all over the place, all over the world, including right around the corner right now, for nothing, for no good reason. And we are trying really hard to do this in a scientific way so that people don't die unnecessarily. Now, let's be honest. You can't make a revolution. You can't go up against this thing and defeat them and nobody's going to suffer and nobody's going to die. Okay, let's be honest. You know, there's no good point. In fact, it works against everything we need to be going for if you go up and lie to people and tell them some easy way to do this. But at least let's not have it be for nothing. Let's not have it be only to keep the same thing going that generation after generation. You know, your kids are going to come up and face the same thing or worse than what you're going through, whether it's the police or someone that just like you who's going to do them in. And, you know, so we're really working very hard to be very scientific so that, yes, people are going to need, when it comes down to it, to fight and die, but at least let's not have it be stuff that doesn't count for anything and really works against what we need to do. At least let's make it count for a future that's better for all the people in the world, the great majority of people in the world who are suffering terribly under this system, including for all the violence that's brought down on them, and for absolutely no good reason and completely unnecessarily. So consent decrees are not going to solve the problem.
So let's make our lives and what we do with our lives really count for a future that's better for all the people of the world. That's where Bob Avakian ended, and I think it's something that for this segment and for today, I once again am going to say, marinate on this, think about this, talk about this with your friends. This is some really important stuff that is really concentrates the future for so many of our youth, and those youth concentrate a good deal of the future of whether or not there'll be a revolution. I'm not going to repeat what he just said, but I do want to recommend that you go to the website revcom.us. You can find this clip there in the section of the website on the film, Why We Need an Actual Revolution, How We Could Really Make a Revolution. You can watch the whole film, which you should do repeatedly, and talk about it. Write us at our email address, comment below, and we're going to do segments and have discussions about what was concentrated in this section in the coming weeks and months. So with that, we'll move to our third segment.
For our final segment of the Revolution Nothing Less show today, we want to take a look at a major development in the last few weeks and the last few days, which is the emergence of fascist, organized, armed rallies and white supremacist rallies taking place in state houses and in the public square across this country. And more than that, we've seen a leap in the normalization of these armed rallies and fascist rallies, where it's barely even mentioned or it's one of many headlines on the news. But we're not going to treat it that way on this show because we recognize the danger this represents and the future that is taking shape before us. These rallies took a leap when armed fascists stormed the State House in Michigan. They directly targeted a Democratic governor that Donald Trump has repeatedly and personally targeted. This is not a coincidence.
All she does is she has no idea what's going on.
As this unfolded, you saw state representatives wearing bulletproof vests, their hands shaking as they tweeted out pictures of themselves with armed men circling above them, afraid of what might erupt. And when Donald Trump was asked directly about death threats that had come from these kinds of people against governors and other representatives who are being targeted, he didn't condemn this. He didn't distance from it. He defended these people as good people who are legitimately frustrated and want their lives back, as if they are the victims.
The governors are getting death threats. Governors of Kentucky, Michigan, Virginia, they're getting increased levels of death threats. And are you concerned that you're talking about liberation and the Second Amendment and all this stuff? Are you inciting violence among the few people?
I've seen the people. I've seen interviews of the people. These are great people. Look, they want their life back. Their life was taken away from them.
These people are rallying under the banner of Reopen America, declaring that they want their right to go out and not be under quarantine, not have to practice social distancing and sheltering at home. And not only is this incredibly dangerous in terms of the need right now for social distancing to control a pandemic for which there is no immunity and there is no treatment and there is no cure and there is no vaccine. Not only is this endangering lives, especially those who are most vulnerable and targeted under this system, Black people, Latino people, Native Americans, where the pandemic has ravaged communities at much heightened rates, as well as the elderly and the sick. Not only is this endangering those, and that's not a coincidence either, but it's deeper than that. These are fascist rallies. I said white supremacist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, Donald Trump, Mike Pence supporting fascist rallies. And this coursed through the center of these rallies, and you saw it all over the place. We know this is true, both because of the work, frankly, Bob Avakian has done over years to analyze the development of fascism in this country, the emergence of it now in this fascist regime, and the many streams that have come together and come to the fore more and more in recent days. But we also know this because on the basis of this understanding, we have been engaged in a fight to lead people to stand up against this, and we took the Revolution Nothing Less show out into the streets to document what was going on and to document those forces, refuse fascism as well as the Revcoms who are standing up against this. The Revolution Nothing Less show had Pete on the street.
This is Pete on the street. I'm with the RNL show, the Revolution Nothing Less show, and we're out here in front of this Nazi, fascist, white supremacist rally of people gathering together to claim their individual rights over the humanity of people here and all around the world, including the planet itself. And the Revcoms are going up against that to confront it for what it is, while maintaining our social distancing and wearing our face masks to say revolution, nothing less. And people have got to get with the new communism. And at the same time, through this segment, you're going to hear these fascists claim that they have antibodies.
And then the virus can't spread anymore because we build up the antibodies.
Claim that it's in their blood.
I got Russian blood, so that means I can't get viruses, I can't get sick.
That they are immune to the coronavirus and coming up with all kinds of crazy things.
You just gotta keep your immune system high, drink, smoke, and toilet.
Other than going to the science and the root of all this. All right, let's see what's going on.
Back on the sidewalk. We're gonna open the street up, folks. Back on the sidewalk, please. protest, many of them wearing orange t-shirts, holding signs in the middle of Spring Street.
Humanity first!
So that's some pretty heavy footage we just saw, and we're going to get into it more. To do this, I'm very happy to say not only did we have Pete on the street, we've got Pete here in the studio with us. Hey, Pete, why don't you come on over here and join us on the set?
All right. Let me get this mask off.
All right, Pete,
All right.
how you feel?
It's nice to be in front of the cameras.
We're so happy to have you here, for real. Let me tell you, it was very intense what you were in the middle of. I guess I'd like to ask you first, what was it like being out there?
I mean, I saw those videos, right, of what happened in Michigan, and we knew that these protests were going to happen in front of City Hall with this fascist rally, and we did some preparation, in that. We weren't just going to go out there and confront them. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and and we had to take the precautions, right? We're going out there and we're taking our risks, and so we had to make sure we had our mask on, we had gloves on, and we were going to maintain or try to maintain some social distancing, And I was out there, and as part of this Pete on the Street segment that we're starting with the RNL show. But it was just really intense, It's really intense out there, and it's scary, these fascists, because they deny science, They deny that there's actually a pandemic and that they should, follow the rules of social distancing, of putting on their masks. A lot of people out there, they were packed like sardines.
Well, let me ask you. I was going to ask you in the segment when you introduce it, you say, "Oh, I'm going to show you that there's a lot of white supremacy here. There's a lot of anti-science. There's a lot of denialism about the pandemic." And then you said, "And I'm going to show you some crazy stuff." So did you see that?
There was a lot of crazy stuff out there, and people, these fascists went from talking about the herd immunity to the fact that they have strong blood, and if you have weak blood, then you're going to end up dying. And if you have strong blood, then you're going to survive through it, even though it was under the context of, I have Russian blood. Like, look, you're talking about white supremacy here. You're talking about white supremacist blood. You're putting millions of people's lives at risk here and all around the world by going out there and, not maintaining social distancing, not putting on masks, but more importantly, this toxic ideology of me, me, me. What about my rights? What about my education? What about my rights to getting a job and all this? Well, no, we went out there, and the Revcoms went out there to actually confront all of this, and that meant taking our risks, but that didn't mean putting other people's lives at risk, It meant going up in the face of all that at a time where too many are on their couches, and using COVID as an excuse to sit it out. And these fascists are using COVID to say that this is a time for them to go out and fight for their individual rights, their individual liberty, live free or die, Well, who's gonna die, We think about, we're fighting for the interests of immigrants, of Black, Latino people who are going to be disproportionately affected by this COVID crisis. I'm talking about the Revcoms here.
Mm-hmm. When you posed that, or when the Revcoms posed that, how did the Reopen crowd respond?
They replied with America first, waving their flags, just people on top of fascists on top of coming out of the windows of their car, waving the American flag, America first, and the Revcoms came out there with, humanity first. American lives are not more important than other people's lives.
What did that mean to you? What do you think it means to humanity that there was a force out there in the face of this, the Revcoms?
I mean, when you think about these fascists and what they're doing across the country, you know, and armed white supremacist fascist militia groups, you know, storming the entrances of, you know, the Congress in Michigan, you know, and all the ways that they've been emboldened and unleashed by this fascist regime, you know, really gave backing to the interests of humanity here. For the Revcoms to go up, straight up, and confront that, and call on more people out into the streets, you know, uniting with the call that was put out by Refuse Fascism. And the Revcoms were out there agitating, you know, on social media, on live stream, you know, to the thousands of people who really need to hear this, and not just hear this, but come out to the streets, you know. And for those who actually care and don't want to live in this world no more, get with the revolution, get with the new communism, get with BA.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask also, you mentioned Refuse Fascism, which I think is really important. I know, and hopefully we'll share some of the footage. Refuse Fascism did protests around the country everywhere they could to counter these fascist rallies. If there's anything else about their message or what they were doing there that you want to share.
I mean, going up in the face of these fascists is like I said, is a scary thing, you know, and whether their denial of science and their backing of the fascist regime, going up straight against that actually takes risks, you know, and just seeing the lack of conviction that, you know, on the side of progressives and liberals who are sitting this out, it actually was part of, you know, great joy to actually be a part of getting out there and confronting these fascists and calling on the millions that we actually need to be out in the streets to drive out this fascist regime. There was a lot of, you know, joy that came from that, you know, as we continuously need to call out more people out on the streets, you know, and just, you know, going out there and, you know, when I was interviewing these fascists, you know, it kind of just brought to mind what Revcom has been covering, what the communiques have been covering, you know, in terms of reminding back to the days of, you know, the white settlers coming over and spreading their smallpox, you know. Just thinking about the days of desegregation, when you think about these black students who were coming into these what was formerly known as, you know, white schools and being spat on, you know. This is a whole under different context because it's under a pandemic, you know. The people's lives are at risk here. And it was great to actually go up against that, you know.
One other dimension that I think is important to peel back the sheets on, actually, the white sheets on, is these are billed as Reopen America rallies. And they were shot through. In Michigan, I think a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol, they were using that word boogaloo, invoking that they're trying to accelerate a civil war, a race war. Some of them were dressed in ways that signify that. If you are not into the race war, you might not know the meaning of their dress, but this is something that they were doing. And you see this in some of the fascists who are in the streets in Los Angeles, coming in the face of, I know, Bo, one of the members of the Revolution Club, who's an a vet from the Iraq War who turned against that war and turned against the imperialist system and joined the revolution, and they were calling him out by name. So there's this kind of thing targeting very organized fascists at the core of this and coordinated with Trump and the whole regime. But there were also people who were broader, who maybe weren't so overt themselves or not even that formed themselves as fully fascist, but they were being mobilized on this me first, reopen. Could you talk a little bit, because I think this has been used to say, oh, these weren't all fascists, these were something else, but there was something going on that was more in unity there. Or what did it appear like on the street?
Well, yeah, you know, on the street, when I was interviewing, you know, different people, you know, there was I guess you could say there were different strains of this, you know, who were part of this Reopen America stuff. You know, I talked to a family that was multilingual, and you know, the teenage woman who was in high school was talking about her education, you know, and the fact that, you know, because of COVID-19 and because of the lockdowns, that, you know, she wasn't able to learn as well online, and so her grades were slipping, you know. Other people, you know, had signs of live free or die, and, had their own, story to why, they were out there,
Okay, well, I would like to, I want to bring Andy in.
Yeah, well, first off, I'm glad that Pete got out in the street. We've been planning that since the beginning of this show, and you've been sheltering in place, correctly so, but now you're out in the street. That's great. Well, look, I think Pete covered a lot of what needs to be talked about, but I'll just maybe add something about 2 points that he spoke about. One is these rallies that took place that were not directly part of the fascist rallies, that were, in fact, some of them, like in Long Island, distinguished themselves from these fascist rallies. He said, well, we're just here because we're Americans and we want our freedom. It's up to us to decide whether or not we shelter in place. It's up to us to decide whether we go to work, go to play, go to the beaches, and all these kinds of things. The problem is it's actually there. You think that you have a right to do whatever you want. That's what you think that being in this country means. But the fact of the matter is that there's a larger society out there that you actually are a part of, and you are asserting that right over the interests of humanity, including that what you were doing here is, as you know, disproportionately affecting black and brown people, immigrants, people, disabled people, elderly, people in nursing homes. It's not neutral what you're doing, and even worse, it's affecting people, or just as bad, it's affecting people around the world. And this idea that if you're going to insist that you have a right to do whatever the fuck you want, then you need to take off those sneakers with rubber that comes from South Asia. You need to take off the clothes that were made in other countries. You need to stop eating fruit and vegetables that the immigrants pick for you. And if you do all of that, then maybe we'll listen to you and still tell you you're wrong. But you're standing at the top of something here, atop of a food chain that is actually this empire of exploitation, imperialism. So that's the first point, just to round this out, that there are these other rallies, and that actually is part of how fascism comes to power, because they find some ways to take in discontent of a larger population, and then this gives approval to the worst excesses, and people think, well, that's just a fringe. But actually that fringe is driving this, and that fringe is backed up by very powerful forces. The second thing that you spoke about, Pete, is people sitting it out at home. Of course, I do believe people should continue to shelter in place as long as that's necessary, but I think we have to be clear that the Democratic Party is a ruling class party, and as such, they've never, since the beginning of this administration, mobilized the masses of people to take to the streets, which is the only way you're going to drive out this regime. And we've talked about this many times, but if Trump is re-elected, if Trump loses bias in the Electoral College and says it's rigged, and even if Trump himself somehow or other goes, if he's defeated both ways, which is not at all a sure thing, what about this whole fascist movement? Not only the stormtroopers in the street here, but also all the forces behind them. What will you do then? And too many people are going along with an idea of painless progress, that all you have to do is vote in November and you will deal with this. But back to the Democratic Party, as Avakian has made clear in the film "The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go," that to the Democrats who are part of maintaining this system, order is more important than justice, even if it means a fascist order. And that's been shown over the last couple of years. So I just want to clarify one point. It's true that out in the streets in Los Angeles on May 1st, there were the revolutionaries squared off against the fascists, and that represented two different futures: a revolutionary future for the emancipation of all humanity and a fascist future. But that's not all who was out there in the square, and that's not all who was out there in the country demanding that the country open up and that the shelter in place end. This included, many people. Let me just say what this other future was. There were people out in the streets, and there's people in this country, in fact, probably the majority of people, who don't want the Trump-Pence fascism. They don't know very much, if anything, about the revolution and the new communism. But what they want is they want the Democrats to come to power. They wanted things to go back to the way they were before. including in the organization that we formed, Refuse Fascism. There are many people who believe in the Democratic Party or reforming the Democratic Party. And that represents that there's two futures within the system itself that are clashing. The fascist future and what has been before. And, many of these people are going to vote for Joe Biden. And this is something, as I've said before, it's not, the problem is not that Joe Biden is sleepy, but that he's a representative of this ruling class, and done all kinds of things that the people who are actually going to hold their nose and vote for him wouldn't support. And we want to be struggling with those people over why that is not only not an answer for the emancipation of humanity, but to be honest, people, and to actually confront the reality that we face. You're not going to go back to what was before. First off, what came before was not good for the majority of humanity. And secondly, it's not possible. These fascist forces are consolidating, and they're going to have to be driven from power. And then ultimately we need a revolution. So we see ourselves as bringing forward a third future in opposition to the two futures of this system. And with that second future that says, okay, can we go back to what was before, please? Can we have our country back? We want to be struggling with all those people as we stand shoulder to shoulder in fighting and getting out into the streets to remove this regime from power. And I think together with all of those people, we can say, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. So those are the points I wanted to add. And I know you have a little bit more of the show. Actually, we have a very important thing to come that Sansara is going to tell you about. But because we're ending on that point, let me say for myself and to thank the audience for watching episode 7, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, well, I think that was very important. We're going to stay on this because this fascism is not going away. So I really want to thank Pete for being out in the street. I want to thank you for spending the hour plus with us watching this episode. If you learned anything in this episode, if it sparked questions in your mind that you want to hear more about, if there's things you disagree with and want to argue about or clarify, write to us and comment below. Please take a minute and do that. We read these, we respond to them, we learn from them. Also, spread the word. We need to let the world know about this Revolution Nothing Less show. You're not going to get what you get from this show anywhere else. Tell your friends, tell your family, spread it on social media, and go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/therevcoms, and become a sustainer of our show. At whatever level you can, join the community of people who are putting this show on, engaging with it, and fueling this revolutionary media as part of the movement for an actual revolution. So with that, I want to close out by turning over the mic to Luan, who is going to share the May Day communique, which Pete referenced, which we spread, the Revolution Tour wrote, and we spread all over the country among people of every background, summoning them to revolution on this revolutionary internationalist holiday, a call to real revolution and the new communism.
A world on fire from environmental devastation. A world of 7 million refugees fleeing war and climate catastrophe. And where none of the powers that be have any real answers to this. A world being taken over by fascist regimes, whipping up genocidal xenophobia and religious fundamentalism, slamming women and LGBTQ people back into the Dark Ages forms of oppression, attacking science and promoting ignorance, all backed up with brute force. A world now ravaged by disease, made 1,000,000 times worse by the pre-existing inequalities of this system, where Black people, Latinos, and Native Americans are dying at much higher rates, and America's overflowing prisons and immigration jails are in danger of becoming death camps. When the basis exists to end this madness and get on the road to overcoming all forms of inequality and oppression. A world where the wealth, technology, and global interconnection of humanity could enable us to meet people's needs and work together to solve problems. Where today, people are kept in ignorance, when they could be trained with a scientific method to understand and change the world, with all the wonders of discovery and ability to meet the challenges that opens up. But instead, the world is held in chains by a capitalist imperialist system. A system not based on cooperation, but on private ownership and profit, driven by ruthless competition between capitalists and nation states. A system that today gives millions the choice of risking death and disease or facing the certainty of imminent hunger. A system that is nothing but an obstacle to humanity. A system that is today being reinforced by fascists like Donald Trump and his MAGA moron foot soldiers running around demanding America be reopened while the coronavirus is still in full effect. On May 1st, we declare our determination to overthrow this system through revolution, when the conditions for that revolution have come into being, and to build a world community of humanity without borders, without oppression, exploitation, and all the destructive divisions between people, a communist world. That world is possible, and we have the key to unlock that possibility. The new communism developed by Bob Avakian, BA, the most important political thinker and leader in the world today. Bob Avakian has advanced the science of revolution, developed a strategy for revolution that could actually win, and authored the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America, the vision and blueprint for the future society on the road to human emancipation.
Why is this the state of humanity? There is one fundamental reason. The basic nature of the system of capitalism, imperialism that we live under, and the way, because of its very nature, it continually perpetrates and perpetuates horror after horror. And in fundamental terms, we have two choices. Either live with all this and condemn future generations to the same, or worse, if they have a future at all, or make revolution.
If you want to know more about this revolution and the world it aims for, and learn more as you participate in working to bring that into being, join us today and help getting this communique out. Go to revcom.us and begin to get into Bob Avakian, BA.